Maya stood in the sunlit living room and pictured a life that finally fit: a small table by the window where Isaac could color, a second bookshelf for the paperbacks she kept unread, and the soft hum of a laundry machine that did not require coins. Isaac had left a crooked sun on a scrap of paper and ran around announcing where his trucks would park. The landlord bent down, ruffled his hair, and smiled. "We love families here." For a few bright minutes, the apartment felt like a hinge swinging open. She could imagine mornings with more countertop, a place for Isaac to spread his crayons, and a small plant on a windowsill that would not be in danger of being knocked over when she cooked. The agent handed her a paper application and suggested she submit it that afternoon because units in the building moved quickly. Maya left the tour with a hopeful steadiness that felt, for once, deserved. Maya had built her life on careful steps. She worked full-time as a project manager at a neighborhood nonprofit, balanced client meetings with school pickups, and kept a modest savings account that made landlords nod at her reliability. Isaac, 6 years old, had routines she protected: Saturday pancakes, after-school drawing sessions, and a bedtime story that required 2 voices. Their one bedroom was cozy but cramped. It suited them, but it was not a home she could imagine staying in for years. The Willow Street apartment promised proximity to Isaac's school, a slightly quieter block, and the small, ordinary comforts that make a neighborhood feel like belonging. The showing had been pleasant and surprisingly warm. The unit smelled faintly of lemon, sunlight painted the hardwood floors, and the landlord answered questions with practiced ease. He listened when Isaac explained why toy trucks needed parking spaces and commented that a family like theirs would suit the building. At the end of the tour, he handed Maya the application and floated the suggestion that in a market like this, speed mattered. It felt reasonable in the moment. Maya left paying attention but not alarmed. The next morning, the listing was gone. When Maya called the agent, she heard a familiar response: "Someone acted faster. These units move quickly." The phrase is banal in a tight rental market. Immediate uptake happens, yet the timing pinched. The agent had emphasized family fit and had noted Isaac by name. The apartment had shown well for them. A sudden disappearance within hours did not align with how the agent had talked. The casualness of the refusal landed like a small, sharp bruise. Something about the moment felt unaccounted for. Questions gathered into a pattern that made her uneasy. Was an internal referral system quietly prioritizing applicants who were known to the manager? Were broker networks steering certain profiles to the top of the window? Or was someone leaning on coded language, neighborhood fit, professional references, timing, to exclude households like hers? Maya had read about covert practices, listings that vanish and reappear with different terms, or selection that privileges some applicants while effectively closing the door on others. Those reports had felt distant until she stood on that stairwell with a paper application in her hand. She did not want the moment to become a private wound. Maya documented the showing in careful detail: the agent's name, the unit number, the exact words he used, and timestamps for when she had seen the online listing. She saved cached screenshots and sent a pragmatic message to a friend who worked in property management, asking whether rapid relistings and overnight takedowns were typical. The reply, sometimes but not usually in this pattern, moved her from puzzled to purposeful. That night, with Isaac's crooked son folded into her notebook, she made a plan. First, document every showing, every name, and every timestamp. Second, monitor listings for subtle edits or relists that could indicate targeted outreach. Third, if the pattern repeated, run a controlled inquiry. Have a friend with a different profile ask about the same unit and compare treatment. The steps were neither dramatic nor grand. They were methodical, small acts meant to turn humiliation into evidence. Her motivation was simple and stubborn. She wanted a place where Isaac could fall asleep to the same ceiling each night and wake up without the threat of sudden upheaval. The work ahead would be slow and uncertain, but it would create a trail that polite excuses could not easily erase. As the streetlights came on and the block quieted, Maya closed her notebook and felt a quiet steadiness she had not felt in days. In the morning, she would open her laptop and begin to assemble the file that might show whether a market, its gatekeepers, or some combination of forces were quietly deciding who belonged. Maya assumed the first apartment was a fluke, a rapid online listing that vanished in a competitive market. She kept her schedule tight and, a week later, drove across town to see another promising two-bedroom with a small yard. The listing had everything she wanted: safe block, good light, and a landlord who mentioned being family-friendly in the listing blurb. The tour felt familiar in a comforting way. Isaac investigated closets as if they were caves, the agent smiled, and Maya imagined a life rearranged around the slightly larger kitchen and a place where Isaac could ride a scooter on the sidewalk. After they left, buoyed with the possibility, Maya followed the agent's instructions and submitted her application right away. She waited for the confirmation that usually follows solid paperwork: an email, a request for references, a tentative move-in date. Instead, she received a text: "Sorry, unit just rented." The message felt like a shovel. The agent's language was the same as before. Someone else had moved faster. There was no concrete detail, no offer to explain who or why. The familiarity of the phrase, delivered with practiced politeness, made it harder to press without sounding paranoid. Doubt crept in, then sharpened. Maya called the agent and asked for clarity. On the phone, he was polite but vague. "We had an applicant wait list and someone accepted today," he said. "These things move fast." Maya pressed. Had there been multiple applicants at the showing? Had anyone put down a deposit? The agent repeated the company line: timing, speed, first come. It was plausible on its own, but together with the earlier apartment, it began to feel like a narrative designed to keep questions at bay. She began to notice small inconsistencies. Online listings for similar units changed language overnight. Features moved from one post to another. Price reductions followed immediate disappearances and then reappeared with new photographs. A conversation with a friend who worked in real estate suggested subtle tactics. Favored applicants called in from partner broker lists. Units could be held for preferred renters, while public listings were used to generate interest. Brokers sometimes shielded preferred applicants from public competition by circulating units through private channels. That line between public listing and private pipeline mattered more than she'd realized. Maya's pragmatic instincts turned investigative. She listed the dates of each showing, the agents' names, and the timestamps when listings had disappeared. She started to take screenshots immediately upon viewing. She learned to copy metadata from listing pages and to archive cached versions. Documentation felt like armor. It was not confrontation, but preparation, evidence in case the pattern proved more than coincidence. At a neighborhood meetup, she mentioned her experience to a woman named Priya, who worked for a housing nonprofit. Priya listened and then described seeing similar patterns in other parts of the city. A rotation of applicants, relisting that favored direct referrals, and language like neighborhood fit used to rationalize rejections. Priya suggested a discreet experiment. Have someone with a different profile inquire about a unit and track responses. Maya hesitated at first. The idea felt intrusive, but it also felt like a practical way to test whether access hinged on who asked. They planned carefully. Priya's colleague, a white friend named Claire, would pose as an applicant and contact the same broker for a showing. Claire would use a neutral script and submit a plain application without mentioning community connections or bargaining for perks. Maya would compare emails, response times, and whether the unit remained available to others. The goal was not to entrap, but to illuminate whether access to housing was being distributed by something other than public listing order. When Claire called, the response was swift. She was offered a showing within 2 days, asked about availability to move quickly, and told the unit might not last long. Her application was acknowledged with an automated confirmation and a follow-up request for references. The contrast with Maya's experience was stark.
Where Maya's inquiries had been met with friendly deferment and a casual "someone else moved faster," Claire received concrete next steps and a tone that suggested genuine consideration. The divergence hurt in an unexpected way. It was not just about losing 2 apartments. It was the realization that an invisible hand might be steering outcomes based on familiarity, networks, or assumptions about who was an acceptable tenant. Maya did not yet have proof for legal action, but she now had a clearer hypothesis and growing resolve. The experiment had provided a sharper lens. The market was not an even field. With comparative notes in hand, Maya and Priya prepared to escalate the inquiry. They would collect more showings, reach out to tenant advocates, and document any relistings that followed. The stakes felt higher now. A pattern of exclusion could mean families like hers were repeatedly denied access to stable housing. The work ahead would require patience, allies, and the willingness to turn small humiliations into demonstrable evidence.
Maya shifted from disappointment to purpose. Losing 2 apartments in quick succession no longer read as bad luck. It read like a pattern. She treated each showing as a data point. The work that followed was deliberate, an attempt to translate an uneasy feeling into facts that could not be brushed aside. She began with what was easiest to capture: timestamps and screenshots. The moment she saw a promising listing, she archived it. Screenshots of the post, copies of emails, and a saved PDF of the listing page. When a unit disappeared, she noted the time and compared cached versions to see whether the description or price had changed. She copied the agent's name, the building address, and the exact words used during the showing. Small details that felt like trivia in the moment mattered now. Next, she widened the net. Maya spoke with neighbors and building staff, asking factual questions. Had they seen the unit advertised before? Had anyone mentioned a preferred applicant? Or had anyone noticed a relist under a different photo? A deli owner shared a story of a unit that had vanished and returned 2 days later with photos that made it look newer. The super confirmed brokers sometimes hold units for known clients. These informal confirmations were useful. Online sleuthing filled gaps. Maya learned to watch listing histories. Platforms sometimes show that data listing was posted or edited. She found near-identical listings reappearing with small wording shifts or slightly different price tags. In some cases, she saw the same contact number listed under different agent names, a sign of broker networks that shuffled units away from public competition. She saved every example in a folder labeled by address. Documentation alone was not enough. She needed corroboration. Priya introduced her to a tenant organizer who suggested a controlled test. Have someone with a different profile inquire about the same unit using a neutral script. If that person received faster access or clearer steps, the contrast could be persuasive evidence of non-random selection. Maya asked Claire, a friend with a different background, to place an inquiry using a simple script. Introduce herself as a prospective renter, request a showing, and follow up if prompted. Claire agreed. Where Maya had been told the unit was already taken, Claire got a phone call arranging a viewing within days and a request for references. The difference was stark. Organizing the material changed Maya's posture. She labeled files, wrote summaries, and added context, notes on what each agent had said, screenshots of relisted posts, and statements from witnesses. The evidence felt weighty because it could move beyond complaint into policy conversation. She also collected human confirmation. Mrs. Chen wrote that she had seen units relist with new photos. The deli owner submitted a note. Claire signed a brief statement describing her inquiry and timeline. These small affidavits gave the digital trail a human map. With a growing file, Maya and Priya planned the next move. Reach out to a housing advocate and request an informal review from the municipal housing office. Evidence would be presented not as accusation, but as a record of anomalies, repeated relistings, differential treatment in inquiries, and broker patterns that bypassed public application order. It was a cautious escalation, enough to demand attention, careful not to overreach before facts were organized. As evening settled, Maya looked through the folder, watching careful saving and planning fold into action. The work had shifted her from someone hurt by exclusion to an investigator asking whether exclusion was being practiced. The shift did not erase the sting of the denials, but it gave her a structure to push back. Her objective was simple: make the pattern visible so it could be corrected. Maya decided that collecting anecdotes had to become a systematic exercise. She enlisted Priya and Claire to help design a simple experiment. Pick a recently listed unit she had toured, have Claire inquire using the same wording Maya would use, and document every response. They would capture timestamps, save email threads, and take careful notes during phone calls. The goal was not to entrap, but to create a clear comparison that could reveal whether access to housing depended on who asked. Claire placed the first call on Tuesday morning. She introduced herself, asked about move-in dates, and requested a showing for that afternoon. Within hours, she received a confirmation email with a scheduled slot, a checklist of documents, and a friendly follow-up asking for references. The broker's tone and the explicit next steps suggested genuine consideration. Claire was given instructions about how to submit an application the same day. An hour later, Maya called the same broker and used nearly identical phrasing. The agent was courteous, but said the unit had just been leased and offered to put Maya on a wait list. He suggested she continue looking because units in that building moved quickly. Maya asked whether a deposit had been placed and whether multiple applicants were involved. The agent reiterated the company line about timing and did not offer concrete steps. Where Claire received a process, Maya received a deferment. They ran the test 2 more times with different buildings and different brokers. Each time, Claire's outreach resulted in a scheduled showing and follow-up instructions. Each time, Maya's outreach was met with polite refusal or vague assurances about being placed on a wait list. In one recorded phone conversation, a broker mentioned keeping a list of preferred applicants. In a separate email, a property manager described holding options for tenants referred by partner brokers. Those phrases suggested a parallel channel that routed some prospects ahead of the public queue. Armed with screenshots, timestamps, saved emails, and witness statements, Maya and Priya met with a housing advocate. The advocate recommended a measured strategy. Request applicant logs and listing metadata from the property manager and from the online platform. If those records were withheld or disclosed irregularities, file a formal complaint with the Municipal Housing Authority. The advocate also suggested preparing an evidence-based public account to build community pressure if administrative routes stalled. They consulted a fair housing attorney as well. The attorney explained that proving intentional discrimination often required connecting differential treatment to a protected characteristic, and that administrative bodies frequently demanded strong documentary evidence. The lawyer advised prioritizing transparency and procedural fairness in the initial complaint. Request records that reveal applicant order, broker referrals, and any internal prioritization criteria. Demonstrating irregular processes, the attorney argued, could compel regulators to probe further. Maya felt a mixture of vindication and trepidation. The experiments had demonstrated repeatable differences in treatment that could be presented to officials. The path forward felt clearer. Obtain records, document responses, and escalate where necessary. Yet escalation carried risks. Filing a complaint could sour relationships with brokers and complicate Maya's ongoing housing search. Publicizing the findings could invite pushback from property managers or skeptical neighbors. They agreed on safeguards. Begin with confidential records requests, coordinate legal steps with the advocate, and prepare a phased public campaign only if the administrative path failed. Before initiating formal requests, Maya requested a face-to-face meeting with a property manager to ask about procedures and applicant logs. She presented her timeline calmly and framed her questions as a request for clarity about market practices. The manager responded politely and reiterated that market speed determined outcomes. When asked about applicant logs, he acknowledged informal notes but suggested the records were inconsistent and not dispositive. Walking away from that meeting, Maya felt the situation tighten. The controlled test had produced two outcomes from two similar inquiries. The data suggested a process that privileged certain applicants over others. With her files spread across the kitchen table and Isaac asleep in the next room, Maya made a choice. She would request records and press for transparency, knowing the decision would shape not only her housing prospects, but the rules of the market itself. Maya decided that submitting an administrative complaint and waiting for officials to act might not be enough. Records requests could take months, and her fear was that opaque procedures would simply stall while the market moved on. Working with Priya and a local tenant organizer, she drafted a clear, evidence-first post. Dates, unit numbers, agent names, screenshots of listings, cached timestamps, and a concise description of the controlled inquiry that showed differential treatment. They redacted personal details, organized the files in a shared folder, and wrote a short caption that stuck to verifiable facts. They published the post to the neighborhood forum and to several citywide housing groups. The response was immediate. Neighbors added comments describing similar experiences. Several people uploaded screenshots or cached pages showing listings that vanished and later reappeared with new photos or wording. A corner deli owner confirmed he had seen a listing disappear and then reappear with refreshed imagery. Within a day, the post had become a running log of examples rather than a single complaint, and private messages poured in from people offering additional records and eyewitness accounts. A housing nonprofit contacted Maya and offered to vet the documents and connect her with a reporter who covers tenant issues. The reporter independently verified several relistings and reported on the pattern: units that were publicly listed and then removed, relists that used different language, and broker contacts that seemed to route favored applicants ahead of a public queue. Her story framed the issue not as a single landlord's failure, but as a larger problem in a tight rental market. A housing policy researcher quoted in the piece explained how opaque referral networks and inconsistent record-keeping can create a two-tiered system that privileges certain applicants. The coverage shifted the dynamics. Social shares extended the story beyond the block, and advocates used the reporting to press the municipal housing authority for comment. The property management company issued a brief statement saying it valued equitable access and would review internal procedures, while declining to answer detailed questions pending that review. The guarded language suggested an attempt to manage reputational risk without admitting policy failures. Going public was not free of cost. Maya felt exposed. Posting company names and dates in public meant inviting scrutiny and potential backlash. A handful of neighbors accused her of creating drama or harming local businesses. Those criticisms hurt. At the same time, she received messages from families who had quietly given up their searches, a former tenant who forwarded an internal email suggesting broker referral lists existed, and a tenant attorney who offered pro bono guidance and next steps. The tenant organizer drafted a petition demanding 3 concrete changes: disclosure of any applicant selection criteria, publication of relisting logs for a defined period, and an investigation into referral practices by brokers and managers. They submitted the petition to the housing authority and organized a small rally outside the property manager's office. About 24 people turned out: families, advocates, and neighbors with handmade signs, and local news outlets covered the event. Under public pressure, the property manager agreed to a mediated meeting and to provide redacted applicant logs for independent review. Maya insisted on legal counsel and an independent third party to receive and preserve the records. In the meeting, the manager defended common industry practices like private referrals, citing market competition, but he also acknowledged that record-keeping was inconsistent and that some informal notes existed. The public campaign produced tangible results. The housing authority opened a preliminary review and requested documents. Some internal materials were disclosed under confidentiality terms, and advocates identified evidence of informal referral lists and irregular relisting patterns. Those findings did not prove intentional discrimination, but they revealed opaque processes that created unequal access. At the same time, Maya worried that speaking out might mark her as difficult in a narrow market where brokers communicate. The tenant group worked to keep public pressure focused on policy rather than personal grievance. By the end of Part 5, the story had moved from a private grievance to a public dossier. Maya's notes and screenshots were no longer only her own. They were a community archive used by advocates and journalists to press for transparency. That shift increased the likelihood that regulators would act, but it also made the next phase more consequential. Formal investigations, potential legal filings, and the need to sustain attention long enough for institutional change. Maya slept less easily in the weeks that followed, but she felt less isolated. Turning a private denial into public evidence had expanded the circle of accountability. The stakes had grown, and so had the possibility of real reform in how access to housing is distributed in her city.
When the Housing Authority opened a preliminary review and requested documents, Maya felt the moment shift from rumor and frustration into formal scrutiny. The municipal office asked the property manager to submit applicant logs, broker communications, and any internal policies related to referrals and wait lists. For the first time, the informal notes and cached screenshots stacked on Maya's kitchen table had the potential to meet an institutional standard. The property manager complied selectively. He produced a pile of redacted emails and a spreadsheet that listed dates and applicant initials, but several entries were opaque. Shorthand phrases, references to brokers without full contact data, and notes like "pref" that were unexplained. The Housing Authority's analyst flagged irregularities, gaps in applicant timestamps, relistings that occurred within hours of removal, and a cluster of referrals that routed through a handful of broker contacts. The initial read was not a courtroom verdict, but it was enough to justify a deeper probe. Legal counsel on the tenant's side helped shape the next steps. The fair housing attorney advised Maya and the tenant group to request the complete unredacted logs under a limited protective order so auditors could examine patterns without exposing private data publicly. The attorney also filed an administrative complaint alleging lack of transparency and potential steering. The complaint demanded that the Housing Authority subpoena records if voluntary disclosure proved insufficient. The property manager pushed back. His lawyer argued that some records were informal and that broker relationships were common industry practice, tools to place tenants quickly in a fast-moving market. He warned that overly aggressive enforcement could choke supply or prompt managers to remove listings from public view entirely. The company also warned reporters that a full audit might be disruptive and insisted it had not discriminated intentionally. The Housing Authority faced a classic regulatory dilemma: act aggressively and risk a protracted legal fight that could delay housing placements, or pursue a measured review focused on correcting procedures. Officials chose a middle path. They issued a subpoena for raw logs and broker referral records while proposing a mediation track that would require the property manager to adopt clearer record-keeping. The mediation would run concurrently with the forensic audit so that policy changes could be recommended promptly if patterns emerged. The investigative audit revealed several concerning practices. The auditor found evidence that some listings were held in private broker channels for short windows before relisting publicly. In multiple instances, relisted posts bore altered photos and revised descriptions that correlated with different target audiences. The logs showed that some brokers repeatedly placed applicants from their own networks at the top of the list. The audit stopped short of proving explicit racial steering, but it showed structural opacity that could facilitate exclusion. That nuance mattered legally. Proving discrimination requires demonstrating that decisions were motivated by protected characteristics. The audit's strength was procedural. It documented discretionary pathways that circumvented advertised first-come processes and created uneven access. The Housing Authority used that finding to recommend rules requiring managers to maintain searchable, time-stamped applicant logs and to disclose any private broker channels used to fill vacancies. The authority also proposed quarterly audits for larger property managers and a requirement that listings remain public for a minimum window before private placements could be made. Pushback continued.
The property manager accepted some recommendations, but resisted any rule that would require publishing broker referral lists, citing privacy and business concerns. He agreed to standardize logs and to notify the authority when private placements were used, but he declined to admit wrongdoing. The tenant organizer cautioned that partial compliance without enforcement could lead to cosmetic fixes rather than substantive change. For Maya, the institutional response was both validating and exhausting. The authorities' measures suggested that the problem was systemic rather than anecdotal, yet the pace of change felt slow. The legal process required patience. Auditors needed time, developers needed hearings, and policy drafts had to be vetted. Meanwhile, Maya still searched for a home and balanced the emotional toll of being in the public eye. There was also the risk of retaliation or blacklisting. Brokers and property managers exchange information, and the attorney advised caution. Maya's housing search became strategic. She worked with allies to access a list of managers who committed to transparent practices. The tenant group helped share leads and vetted listings. That network offered some protection, but did not erase the vulnerability of applying in a market where relationships mattered. By the end of the audit phase, the housing authority issued a set of enforceable recommendations and a timetable for implementation. They established a compliance review and set penalties for managers who failed to maintain clear, time-stamped applicant records. The changes were not universal, but they created lever points for enforcement and a model other jurisdictions could follow. Maya's file of screenshots and statements moved from a kitchen project to a part of municipal policy work. The evidence she gathered had helped transform an individual grievance into a regulatory conversation about fairness and transparency. The next phase would be about converting recommendations into routine practice so that the market's opacity could not keep deciding who belonged.
The campaign moved from audit rooms into the public square. With the housing authority's audit in hand, Maya and the tenant coalition shifted from complaint to construction. Translate findings into enforceable rules and practical tools. They met with council staff, drafted ordinance language, and partnered with a local researcher to propose platform safeguards. Time-stamped listing histories, limits on rapid relistings, and disclosure of private broker placements. The demands were precise and implementable. Maya spoke at hearings as a witness who could point to data. She read dates, described the controlled inquiries, and explained how opaque referral channels had advantaged some applicants. Council members pushed on enforcement details, how to verify logs, what penalties made sense, and how to protect applicant privacy. Those questions shaped the coalition's proposals toward balanced, administratable rules rather than broad prescriptions that regulators might reject. The coalition also produced usable tools. The toolkit included a model complaint letter, a one-page guide for documenting showings, and an open-source script to archive listing metadata. The researchers worked with platforms to prototype APIs that would publish listing histories to authorized auditors without exposing applicant data. The technical proposals turned a moral case into implementable fixes, which made it easier to win political backing. Public pressure helped. Petitions and op-eds framed the work as housing access, not mere protest. Local faith groups, labor unions, and tenant organizations endorsed the measures. A city council member introduced an ordinance requiring property managers to maintain searchable, time-stamped applicant logs for 2 years and to disclose when private broker channels had been used. The draft included modest penalties for non-compliance and the confidential review process to protect applicant privacy. Industry pushback was expected. Property managers warned that heavy-handed rules could slow placements and reduce inventory. The coalition negotiated language to address administrative burden, risk-based audits, targeted triggers based on relisting patterns, and technical assistance for smaller managers. Compromise on process did not mean compromise on transparency. It meant the policy had a chance to be implemented. Implementation proved decisive. The city funded a small compliance unit and contracted an independent auditor to run randomized checks. A secure portal allowed managers to upload protected logs for review. Platforms piloted APIs to provide time-stamped histories to auditors. Early audits found fewer opaque placements in participating portfolios. The rules did not stop every circumvention, but they made irregular processes discoverable and costly. Grassroots work continued to matter. Volunteers ran pop-up clinics to help renters request records and taught neighbors to archive listings. Maya led workshops showing how to document showings and read metadata. These practical skills ensured transparency translated into power. Documentation made it possible to trigger audits and to correct records. The campaign achieved measurable shifts. The ordinance reduced opportunities for opaque private placements and created enforcement pathways. Some managers adopted voluntary transparency pledges. Others resisted, and the need for ongoing audits remained clear. Maya accepted that progress often looked incremental. The goal was durable change, norms and tools that made exclusion harder to hide. Beyond policy, the campaign shifted conversation. Neighbors began to ask systems questions about platforms, broker networks, and disclosure rather than assume market excuses. That change in public literacy mattered as much as any law. It made it harder for gatekeepers to hide behind vague phrases. For Maya, the work bridged private need and public good. She secured temporary housing for Isaac and found a short list of managers committed to transparent practices. But the larger gain was structural. Policies, technical safeguards, and community capacity that increased fairness for future applicants. The crooked son Isaac had drawn rested in her wallet like a small proof of purpose. The market would keep changing, but the neighborhood had learned to shine a light and demand a fairer ledger.
Months after the first showing disappeared, Maya stood in an apartment that felt like a small miracle. Boxes were half unpacked, sunlight brightened Isaac's crayons on the table, and his crooked son was taped above his bed. This place did not erase everything that had happened, but it restored a small measure of stability she had not expected so soon. The institutional response that followed was practical and enforceable. The city passed a rule requiring property managers to keep clear, time-stamped applicant logs and to disclose when private broker channels had been used to place tenants. A small compliance team began running randomized audits of managers with large portfolios. Several listing platforms piloted secure auditor access so regulators could review listing histories without exposing private applicant information. Those steps did not remove every loophole overnight, but they made hidden processes visible and costly. The Housing Authority's audit documented repeated relisting behavior and referral clusters that advantaged private placements. The audit did not always prove intentional discrimination, but it showed structural opacity that allowed unequal access. The authority recommended remediation for portfolios with irregular practices. Some managers improved record-keeping, a few firms issued modest settlements to affected applicants, and the Tenant Coalition's toolkit, screenshot templates, a model records request email, and a one-page showing checklist, was picked up by community centers and legal clinics across the city. Maya paid a personal price. Media attention and sustained organizing demanded time she could scarcely spare between work and parenting. The stress of being the public face of the campaign was real. She learned to set boundaries, let spokespeople handle some interviews, rely on pro bono counsel for filings, and ask volunteers to manage outreach when she needed space. Those choices preserved energy and kept the campaign from consuming her family life. Still, there were practical returns. Isaac stopped pausing at the doorway. He played on the rug without looking back. Neighbors messaged Maya to say the toolkit had helped them secure viewings and avoid confusing relistings. Early audits recorded a measurable reduction in opaque private placements in pilot areas, and searchable logs let auditors flag suspicious relistings quickly. Those results mattered because they reduced the chance that future applicants would quietly lose opportunities the way she had. The lessons are direct and actionable. First, documentation matters. Screenshots, Cached pages, timestamps, and brief witness notes convert suspicion into testable evidence. Second, controlled, ethical comparisons, placing comparable inquiries from different profiles, can reveal non-random patterns that individual incidents obscure. Third, coordinated civic pressure. Tenant groups, reporters, and legal clinics working in concert moves regulators from statements to enforceable rules. Fourth, policy must be precise and practical. Require time-stamped logs, minimum public listing windows, and routine audits so transparency is not optional. Maya's experience also made clear that individual action has limits, and collective scaffolding matters. Her kitchen folder became a public dossier because neighbors, tenant organizers, and researchers helped translate a private complaint into concrete policy proposals. Technical tools paired with practical resources made enforcement feasible. Without that infrastructure, personal documentation often stays private. With it, private records become the foundation for lasting change. If you face a similar pattern, start here. Document every showing with screenshots and timestamps. Keep brief notes of conversations and witness names. Request applicant logs or a records review from the manager, and connect with a tenant organization or legal clinic before going public. The campaign toolkit linked below includes a sample records request email and a one-page documentation checklist you can use immediately. The crooked sun on Isaac's wall was a small talisman of why the work mattered. Maya still checked listings carefully and kept the toolkit folder in her kitchen drawer, but she no longer carried the raw panic that had pushed her into action. In its place was a steadier conviction. When neighbors organize, document, and demand transparency, markets change. Ordinary families can reclaim ordinary days, and that steady safety is worth the fight.